Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is part 2 of what I had assumed would be a multiple part series. I just wasn't quite sure that it would end up being multiple parts quite so soon. Last month, I did part 1 of reacting to some 1-star reviews of my favorite books of all time, basing these off of my list of favorite books that I did back at the very end of May of this year. So just a little over a handful of months back at this point. I don't know how to do math in my head anymore. This month, today, we are going to be doing part 2 of that, where last month I covered books number 10 through 6 on my list of favorites. Today we're going to be doing number 5 through 1 on my list of favorites. So this is going to be pretty exciting. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed the last one, and if you want to see more on this, I could do a couple more parts on this, I'm sure, on books numbers 11 through 20, basically, that I covered in my favorite books video. And if you want more info on that, that video is available for you to watch. But be sure to let me know if you want more of that, and maybe I'll consider doing a part 3 or maybe even a part 4 next year. We will see. But for now, I think it's time to just go ahead and run right over onto my desktop so that we can start reacting to reviews. Number 5 on my favorite list of books is Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. So let's talk a couple of these reviews. The first one is one given to me by Mal Rubius. I had a couple of my friends collect these reviews for me so that I could react to them without my having to look through and read them. So this is my first time seeing any of these reviews. First off, this is seriously one of the worst books I've ever read, says Amelia. The only reason I finished the book is because I cannot put a book down once I start. Valid. I know plenty of people like that. I usually tend to be like that myself. The writing is terrible. Disagree. The plotting may be dramatic, but I had almost zero interest in any of the characters. I have a hard time believing that. Just on account of my own experience. It's just hard to imagine that personally. They seem to exist merely for events to happen to them, like actors in a disaster movie. I suppose I could maybe see a little bit of what that point is getting at in accordance with the book, but I would disagree on that point, obviously, but I could kind of see that angle a little bit. Beyond that, there seemed to be 3 characters in the book: bad guy, good guy, and good victimized yet able to overcome girl. I would also disagree with that a little bit. That's making more of a caricature of the characters than they actually are. I felt like all these characters were real people, so that's just a personal disagreement. What got me most was Ken Follett seemed so proud of his historical research that he mentions every 40 pages, Blank took out her eating knife. Really, they didn't have forks. How is constantly reminding the audience of this fact important to the story? I honestly never would have noticed because, frankly, the writing of this was so smooth that I never noticed. I was never forced to notice, so I'm sorry that didn't work for you. There were other oft-repeated throughout the novel as well. This seemed like an attempt to fool the audience into thinking they're immersed in the Middle Ages when the rest of the book could have taken place anywhere in time. One fact does not a novel make unless it's a really clever fact. The bad characters keeping the amazing building from completion felt like a Fountainhead ripoff, but that might just be me. I haven't read Fountainhead, so Is that the Ayn Rand book? Is that the title of it? If that is, I haven't read that yet, but, so I can't comment on that particular comparison. But as far as, like, that historical comment, like the attempt to fool the audience into thinking they're immersed in the Middle Ages, I don't think that's what immerses the general audience in the Middle Ages. That might just be, like, a personal disconnect that Amelia had with the book. She definitely said that struggled with the writing, which is fair enough. I think there are going to be a particular audience of people that don't connect with the writing of Pillars of the Earth because it's written very much like in thriller fashion. Like, it's got very much thriller pacing to it, despite being a huge historical epic. So I could see like that maybe disconnect causing some problems, but I just felt like it was tonally what immersed me in the time period and in the characters and in the setting. It wasn't the writing per se, it was the tone of it. And that's a little bit harder to convey, I guess. And that's obviously not going to work for everybody, even though it seems to work for most people with this book. This is a very popular book, in my opinion, for good reason. On the positive question mark side, the book is an extremely easy read, correct. I might have enjoyed it more were I laying in the sun half drunk on something sweet and rum-filled. Violent sex too, if that sort of thing titillates you. Weird comment, but okay. Thank you, wait, for warning me of Oprah's evil plan. If I can save one person from reading this book, my work will be done. I'm not sure what that last paragraph is specifically in comment about, but as far as the extremely easy read, might have enjoyed it more in a different circumstance, I think that's valid. I mean, I know some people who had a little bit of a disconnect, a relative disconnect with Pillars of the Earth on account of it being, like I said, very much written differently than you might expect for a historical epic to be written. It's not written as if it comes from the time period that it depicts. It's very much written in like a modern, pretty thriller-tinged style, so it reads very quick, very easy. So that part of the review is correct. Like I said, on that positive question mark side, I would say that that's generally positive. I think one of the reasons why Pillars of the Earth works so well for so many people is because of how easy it is. But now we're going to go ahead and take a look at a couple other reviews sent to me by Reen. We'll let this first one load. Oh, it's literally just the same review, so I only have 2 reviews to cover for Pillars of the Earth. That's fun. So let's open up a different one instead. And look at Donnie's review that says, I really can't comprehend what people liked about this book. The characters were one-dimensional, disagree. The plot was weak, heavy disagree. And the editor was clearly on vacation when he was supposed to be proofing this book. How many times do I need to be reminded of Aliena's broad hips or William's menacing stare? Those are just writer's quirks. You don't proof repetition unless it's like several times on the same page. That's coming from a copy editor's perspective, but maybe if it's overbearing, but I don't recall taking notice of anything like that personally. In either case, not to mention the numerous drawn-out scenes dealing with rape and violence that added nothing to the story but simply left one with a feeling of disgust. No, they were meant to leave you with a feeling of disgust, particularly relating to the characters, and they actually do stuff for the story because of the character work. Pillars of the Earth is arguably more of a character study book than it is a plot book, even though there is a centralized plot that, causes the entire thing to work together in and of itself. But I would say that all of those scenes were actually important enough for that character work that I couldn't even recommend reading this book if you really, really cannot stomach that kind of content, because it is vital enough for those characters, and for really not necessarily understanding them per se, but really understanding them. That's the way to say it. But when I say understanding, I don't mean in the quote-unquote empathetic way. I mean understanding what those characters are, who they are, and therefore their role within the broader plot, to whatever degree that is. But to understand those characters, you actually, those scenes are actually very important for some of them. So yeah, I would very heavily disagree on that point. Let's see. Do I really need the author to explain in graphic detail every time someone gets raped and or murdered, which happens a lot in this story? Maybe not in graphic detail, but it kind of sells those scenes a little bit. It sells the tone of it a little bit. Like I said, it's one of those things technically you don't need it, and maybe you could read the book skipping those scenes, for example, but I think you would have a much cheaper experience that way. It doesn't feel as authentic because it is such a character study. I think the author got some sick sort of enjoyment out of it. This book might have been okay had it been about 700 pages shorter, but even that's question. 700, dude, that's more than half the book. There's no way. You cannot say that. That's inherently incorrect. But okay, just because a book is long doesn't make it an epic. I mean, sure, yeah, you can have epics that are pretty short, but usually epics are pretty long, and the fact that this is one book at all is pretty good. I would very heavily disagree on 700 pages shorter. You could not do that to Pillars of the Earth, in my opinion. But as far as I think the author got some sick sort of enjoyment out of it, I think people are really way too good in the 21st century at falsely conflating what a person creates with what they actually condone or believe or whatever. And I think that that is what's happening here. Sure, this review is, 17 years old or something like that at this point, but saying that an author got some sick sort of enjoyment out of including some dingier scenes in their book doesn't necessarily mean that they condone that, let alone would enjoy it, or that they get any form of pleasure out of it. In fact, coming from a more authorial perspective, I know that writing scenes like that can actually really mess up a person for a little while. I've written some scenes that were like, I had to, take a step back for a day to recoup, because it is actually pretty emotionally draining. And I think that the vast majority of authors would probably agree with that. And like I said, anyway, it's wrong to falsely conflate enjoyment with, or condonement with something that an author writes. Kind of like in part one, we covered The Shining by Stephen King, and people were just like, this book is just racist and homophobic and misogynistic. And it's like, no, actually, including language that is not being used in a racist or homophobic manner does not make a book racist or homophobic just because you're judging it by different standards, or you're viewing it through a very particular lens instead of the lens that the book is actually depicting, let alone written in. So that's my rant about that. The reviewer says, I'm done ranting now, but seriously, don't read this book. Just read a Fabio novel instead. I haven't read Fabio, so won't comment on that point. But no, you should read Pillars of the Earth, actually, because it is incredible, as a matter of fact. But now we're going to head on to book number 4. Item number 4 within my top favorites, and that's going to be The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So to start, we have Salogdin's 1-star review of Fellowship of the Ring, and for the record, we are doing Fellowship of the Ring here. When I made my list, I didn't feel like I wanted to include The Lord of the Rings as a whole within my list. I just chose one specific entry within it, and Fellowship is arguably my favorite of the 3. So that is the reason why we're doing this book specifically. Sue me. Anyway, Salogdin says, ancient, non-governmental organization conspires to commit perhaps the ultimate act of terrorism in world literature by setting up a crack cosmopolitan team to destroy the primary resource of the predominant sovereignty in the setting, which team includes 4 barefoot ragamuffins with a taste for the sweet leaf, 4 worthless aristocratic sons placed therein as nepotistic favors, and a pious graybeard who gets ganked in his first fight. A little unfair about the pious graybeard who gets ganked in his first fight, but honestly, the rest of that description is accurate. It's just unfortunate that he rated this 1 star, so oof. But as far as the rest of the description, that's actually pretty not wrong. That's like honest trailers, it's just taking the concept of what the book actually is, but making fun of it. And this one felt a little bit more, it would feel lighthearted if it wasn't rated 1 star. So that's just unfortunate that Salogdin didn't like it. But we'll go on to a couple other reviews sent to me by Reen. This one is from Sharina, who says, I hate this book. I'm sorry to hear that. I got it 3 years ago, but never got around to reading it because it seemed so boring. Well, congratulations on getting to it within 3 years, because I have a lot of books that I've not gotten to within 3 years, despite being really, really interested in it. So golf clap for that. But since everyone loves it so much, I decided to read it. This was awful. I think that, probably went into it with well, what would the term be? I wouldn't say like bad expectations per se, but if you expect it to be boring and only read it because everyone else loves it, then you might be a little bit more resistant to liking it. So that's just unfortunate. The whole book could have been 250 pages shorter if the author had removed the stupid history references, which are of no use, and if he had just written, they walked till they reached so-and-so place. Yeah, but then you don't get the world building, and the world building is a large part of what makes Lord of the Rings so special, and it is important, actually. Yes, Tolkien should spend a few sentences describing that tree over there. It is important later, actually. But even disregarding that tangent, Fellowship of the Ring, assuming that you are indeed only trying to review this one book, cannot be 250 pages shorter. The book's barely 400 pages. Like, it's not long. Like, as far as epic fantasy goes, all 3 entries of Lord of the Rings are very, very short. There are plenty of epic fantasy books that aren't not too much shorter than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. Like it's that short, really. It's still upwards of 500,000 pages, but books like Les Mis are that long, even more than that long, even depending on who you ask. So like, it's not like any of these individual pieces are very long. I don't understand. I personally just don't understand why people think Lord of the Rings specifically is so drab and dry and boring and long. I think it's just because it's the first time anybody experiences anything like it, and because of its reputation. In either case, the rest of the review says, walked until they reached so-and-so place. The characters kept walking and camping for 95% of the book. Walk, 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 eat, sleep, more walking, battle, then more walking, awful, hated it. Yeah, this sounds like mostly just an experience of hate reading, I guess. Like, going into it, maybe not necessarily with wrong expectations per se, but perhaps a little bit reluctantly, and that already can be a little bit of a recipe for disaster depending on some experiences. It's just unfortunate that Sharina didn't like this, but it is what it is, really. So let's try another review and read Hesper's critique that says, every few years I let a different, well-meaning friend talk me into picking this up again, and every time I let my sense of sport trump my better judgment. I end up reading the same, or reaching the same conclusion I did when I was 12. This book is unreadable. By me, I'm evidently a tiny and aberrant minority. Well, there's a little bit of self-awareness here, which is great. I'm respect that a lot, and if you've read it multiple times and you don't like it any of those times, I'm very sorry for you, but valid. That's valid, honestly. Like, especially if you've given something a shot multiple times and still didn't like it any of those times, like, huge respect for that, actually, because most people wouldn't do that. So that's actually pretty nice. So let's see what the rest of this review says and how mad it makes me. First off, I should admit that I am Hobbit intolerant. So that, questionable. Anyway, I can't stand those little suckers, their gross feet, and their obnoxiously idyllic Shire. They are romanticized, hairy-footed little people, best described as simple-minded reactionary caricatures. I would disagree on reactionary caricatures, but, as far as, like, simple-minded, and the romanticization angle isn't exactly wrong. Finding the Shire obnoxiously idyllic is maybe a little bit overly critical, maybe, but even like I said regarding the previous review, or one of the previous reviews at this point, a lot of that is because that's kind of the point. By the time you reach the end of Return of the King, there's a reason why the Shire being so idyllic at the beginning of Fellowship is so important. But nonetheless, the elves are not much better with their magicalness and aloofness. Yes, that's where tropes came from. Thank you very much. But at least they don't have gross feet. They're just bigots. Triple question mark on that one. An interesting trade-off, no? Then there are all those epic man-dudes doing long-winded yet epic man-dude things at an excruciating pace, which Tolkien obviously mistook for mythic feel and epic scale. A mistake that instills in me the raging and irrational desire to resurrect the author for the sole purpose of beating him back into the grave with his magnum opus. Well, unfortunate for you, Mr. Tolkien would not accept that, actually. He'd probably beat you back into his own grave with his magnum opus because he's that much cooler. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about Gandalf. Gandalf is better in the movies because Sir Ian. I haven't actually seen the movies recently enough to say whether or not Gandalf in the book or movie is better, but whatever. So the half star, just half, Goodreads is lying to you about this rating, oof, is for the entertainment value I derive out of raging about this book. We all get our kicks where we can. Well, respect on trying it multiple times, but if you hated it this much on any of your reads prior to this one, I guess, or maybe this is just the combined total of all of the times that he's read it, my condolences for not liking a book that is much better than you think it is, in my opinion. That's where I'll go with that. But now we're going to move into entry number 3, which is technically cheating, because I'm talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. These are kind of interchangeable, but I have a couple of reviews for each of them to cover. Our first review for the Iliad is from Keen Reader, and this says, "Sweet baby Jesus, in a bid to try and bridge one of the many knowledge and reading gaps, I've decided to read some more of the old school. I would say I have at least a basic knowledge in Greek and Roman mythology, and know a bit about most of the philosophers and their ideas, etc. But the amount of books I've actually read from antiquity, I can count on one hand." That's actually pretty relatable. I have a good interest in a lot of this stuff and haven't actually read most of the source material, unfortunately for me. So after some planning, I've eventually gotten around to biting the bullet and starting at the start. I read the Odyssey 20 years ago and really enjoyed that. It was an easy enough read, but clearly this is a lot more complex. That is true. The Odyssey is definitely a good bit easier than the Iliad is, and apparently this person really enjoyed the Odyssey, so that's cool. I've been meaning to read the Iliad for years, but I didn't want to read it just to say that I've read it. I wanted to understand it as much as possible, and so for the first time I found myself referring to a series of online guides to help me make some sense of this. From the opening pages, this was a real struggle. Between it being written well over 2 millennia ago and the awkward polysyllabic names, and far too many of them, this isn't a book you can just pick up and sink into unless you have a vast encyclopedic awareness of the hundreds of characters and time and place, or are studying it on a course. To a degree, I could actually understand that criticism. The Iliad is definitely a little bit more difficult than the Odyssey. The Iliad is a little bit more difficult just kind of inherently. There's a little bit more going on. It would have been a lot harder for me to put together if I didn't have the great summaries and other endnotes that like the Peter Green translation came with naturally. Otherwise, maybe even I would have needed a guide. So to a degree, I actually completely understand that part of this critique. There are a lot of names, and actually distinguishing between them and knowing who exactly is on whose side, especially since some characters actually basically share the same name, depending on the translation you go with, that can complicate things a little bit. I have to say, what I read in the book compared to what I read in the many study notes made me feel like I wasn't even reading the same book. Without the 3 or 4 sites I used, I wouldn't have had a clue what was going on. I confess I lost interest in the notes around halfway through, and I battled on alone for the rest of it. Yeah, that's really unfortunate. Definitely, I would say the first half is harder to push through, actually, largely because of those problems. So I'm sorry that you weren't able to use the guides for the back half. That's really unfortunate. But just as I said before, that's honestly a pretty valid complaint. Anybody who has a hard time enjoying the Iliad because it's just difficult for them to get through, and then difficult for them to understand, and then guides not really helping the matter very much, fair enough. I totally see it. I really do. Some take-home points. War is a harrowing and violent thing where all victories seem Pyrrhic. The gods are cruel, awful, and forever needing validation of their greatness, and if they don't think they are receiving it, they act out in childish, petty ways, inflicting suffering on mere mortals to make a point and state their egos. Oh, and if in doubt, blame it all on a woman. Welcome to mythology. This isn't just relegated to this particular poem, this particular story. That's just straight up mythology, generally speaking. I would never in my right mind recommend this to anyone I actually liked. Oof. I find it hard to believe that this was written by the same person who wrote the Odyssey. Well, funny you say that. It might not have been. We don't really know for certain, which is really accessible and a real pleasure to read, and even exciting in places. The Odyssey and the Iliad are definitely tonally and executionally very different, that's for sure. This was a challenge every single page of the way and took plenty of effort to get through, and I can't say I feel any the wiser at the other end of it. Basically, all this review's valid. Like, that's just something Keen Reader struggled with, and honestly, I understand. The Iliad is not easy, although maybe part of it might have to do with translation, presuming that Keen Reader here read the Robert Fagles translation. To be fair, I have not read the Fagles translation of Homer. I have not done that, but I did read Fagles' translation of the Aeneid by Virgil, and that was awful. Like, that translation was just not good. It was not enjoyable to read. It was dull. It was dreadful. Never did it ever inspire anything remotely, comparable to poetry as we think of it today, whereas say my Peter Green translations of Homer were actually very beautiful. I loved those reading experiences. So maybe this is actually a Robert Fagles issue, maybe this is a Homer issue, maybe this is an Iliad issue, maybe this is just a Keen Reader issue. This could be any combination of factors, to be quite frank with you. And it just all seems to have landed in a perfect storm of a keen reader not enjoying it. And like I said, that is valid. Very sorry for this reader, but I understand it, actually. I really do understand it. So let's go for, let's see, a review that covers mostly the Iliad according to Reen. Even though it's a review on the Iliad and the Odyssey, so we'll just take this. DNF, page 347. I don't know where that is, unfortunately. This says, Dibby says, I love mythology and the story of the Trojan War, so I thought I would like this book. Boy, was I wrong. It is boring, and the story/tension is constantly interrupted by over-explaining. I wouldn't call it over-explaining, and more so just kind of being poetry, and just being a very different mode of storytelling than I think most people these days are used to or expecting, I guess. The best example of this is with the character introductions. Yes, this was something, and there's a particular book within the Iliad, I think it's like book 2, where the whole back half of it, there's like 500 lines where it's just listing a bunch of characters and stuff, where like to a reader today this stuff doesn't matter. What does it even mean? Whereas at the time that this was a performance, the Iliad wasn't just a poem, it was like an actual sung performance. These are names or characters that those audiences would have been deeply familiar with, including maybe some people that they knew to some degree who had been like canonized within the storyline. You know, stuff like this where those character introductions are actually like pretty big. And then otherwise it's a matter of the poetry performance aspect of characters being bigger than maybe they otherwise should be. But anyway, whenever a new character is brought out, even if it is just for a quick second to see them die, he goes on and on about who this guy is, who their family is, etc., etc. That's also kind of particular to this style of drama, basically. As awful as it sounds, just stab the dude and move on. Well, unfortunately, the Iliad isn't just another book. That's not what this is about. This is a poem from thousands of years ago, so it's like inherently told a little bit differently. Anyway, he even does this with characters that already have been introduced. Athena is coming in for the 5th time. Time to say who she is again. Maybe somebody forgot. Again, this is part of the performance thing, being repetitive and having like motifs and stuff that are going to be coming through musically. It makes sense to do that. Obviously, this is a product of its time, true. So if you're good reading other books from this period, this will work for you. This was my first read of a book that is super old, and it didn't work for me. Yeah, if you're jumping from only like modern or pretty modern stuff to suddenly doing epic poetry like the Iliad and or the Odyssey, that's a pretty big jump there. You probably should be spending a little bit more time getting used to some things first. But there's that review. And then I think I have another review here for both the Iliad and the Odyssey from Reen. And this one is from Molly, who says, the Iliad and the Odyssey are ancient stories that came before the written word. The oral nature of the tales meant they could be adapted to suit whatever audience in the stories were told in. I find it kind of funny that a story that is all about being adapted hasn't been adapted for the modern audience, which is what my opinions are built upon. I'm going to have a lot of fun with this review then. Let's wet my throat a little bit before we get into this one. The characters aren't really characters, but rather role models of ancient Greece, meaning they are all masters of all traits and always do the right thing according to their philosophy. No, they're just embodiments of their philosophy. That's a little bit different. The dialogue is also difficult to tackle as it uses forever to tell one simple thing. Kind of what I was saying about the performative aspects and also it being an epic poem from a very long time ago where the mode of storytelling was just inherently different. Anyway, again, without adding any depth to the characters. We'll move on. There is also a lack of description of anything that is not a weapon or an armor, which easily takes one out of the story. A problem exclusive to the Iliad is that there are so many characters on different sides, making it difficult to know which side you are even reading about. That is definitely a valid critique. Kind of like what I was saying with the first review for the Iliad that we went over. That is absolutely a valid critique of this particular poem, where without being super familiar with those characters before you even read it, it's going to be very difficult to know who they actually are while reading it. It means like reading it with good summaries and good notes, particularly if those summaries and notes are by the same translator whose translation you were reading it, can make this a lot more approachable, but that's certainly a valid criticism. It should have been more clear which side we were on. And yeah, sometimes it does get a little bit confusing. I confess that. Absolutely. The characters should have had depth. I would disagree about the depth point. It's just kind of a difference in what we're expecting versus what was being done. And the environment should have been described. Again, that one's probably more just, like I said, the modern reader wanting that environment thing where that wasn't as much the thing at the time. Anyway, I understand that my demands are too high for any oral story of their length, but the written word doesn't need memorization. I don't know precisely what you mean by that sentence, but I don't think it's that your demands are too high for any oral story. I think that the demands are just a little bit more modern than the Iliad is, which is valid. If you are looking for knowledge about ancient Greece's culture, warfare, and the relationship with the gods, I highly recommend it to you, but to any other, I wouldn't. Well, I don't know about culture per se, but getting an insight, well, culture maybe tangentially, like kind of implicitly because of this being, a performative work of art from the time. But as far as all those things, like I could see that actually working as a recommendation, funny enough. But to say to any other you wouldn't recommend it, agree to disagree on that point. But we'll end off with the Iliad here and move into the Odyssey and have a particular review here from Lydia that says a couple of comments on this book, a pretty short review on here. Number one, the intro is way too long. I really could care less about Telemachus traveling and proving himself, blah, 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 blah. Those are like framing stuff that it's going on. So, I mean, I guess I could understand the issue with regard to that, but also you said could care less wrong. It should be couldn't care less, but that's a different point. Number two, the battle scene was pretty epic. I'm assuming you mean the climax. Some strange details thrown in there, stabbed in the nipple, gruesome, but kind of funny. Yeah, that was actually something that was funny, more particularly about the Iliad. That one is a very particular thing, and it's probably just something that comes from particular Greek phraseology and maybe something about Greek culture, maybe that meant that was like a common way to put things, kind of the way that we use certain turns of phrase commonly, even if we don't necessarily mean them literally. It might be that was something that was happening. Anyway, number three, I think it's pretty messed up that Odysseus can sleep with whoever he wants and Penelope remains faithful. Repeat, messed up. I think there's a little bit more commentary that should be discussed on that point, so I'm not going to get into it here, but fair enough. Closing comments. I don't really like this book. Well, it's a poem, so I'm sorry about that. The end. Fair enough, honestly. I just think that the Odyssey is super fun, so that's just unfortunate. I have another little bonus review here from Reen. I don't know if this is for a specific book here. It says Iliad and Odyssey again. It says, oh hell, I thought I was an intelligent human being until I tried to read this book. I think I'm going to go back to picture books now. If that's in reference specifically to the Iliad, absolutely I could understand this, but even the Odyssey's not super easy per se. It's just a little bit easier than the Iliad is. But yeah, that's going to be it for those books. We'll go on to Ashes of Man by Christopher Rocchio now. The first review here says, a clear improvement over Kingdoms of Death. That means that this person probably rated Kingdoms of Death like 1 star, because I'm pretty sure Ashes of Man doesn't have any 1-star written reviews, if I'm not mistaken. Ashes of Man retains some of the annoying over-explanation that crept into Rocchio's writing in the previous entry, but generally reads much better and covers a considerably more interesting plot. That's a really interesting thing to note, the annoying over-explanation that crept into Rocchio's writing in the previous entry. The irony for me is that it's actually Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man, these two books specifically, where I feel like Christopher's prose improved dramatically over the first 3. There's a subset of people that love Christopher's prose in all of it, but I distinctly remember my first time reading Sun Eater and reading Empire of Silence, Howling Dark, and Demon in White, and finding like moments of the prose to be good, but I wasn't like wowed by it the way that I kind of expected to be based off of the way that other people talked about it. It was Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man when I decidedly, like, markedly started being wowed by basically everything that was being said. So I don't know, that's kind of interesting that this person obviously preferred a little bit of the earlier prose style as opposed to me. That's more interesting than it is anything else. Hadrian's return to navigating politics once again manages to compensate for the weakness of the supporting cast, and while I still find the battle sequences overstay their welcome, this book probably hosted the best such sequences in the series so far. The problem is once again that supporting cast, and despite my praise thus far, Ashes of Man retroactively makes the rest of the series worse. Excuse me? The supporting cast in Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man, these two books, is really good, actually. It's kind of culmination of a lot of what's being built in the first three books, in my opinion. So that's unfortunate. I also have heard this line of thought about battle sequences overstaying their welcome with regard to Rockio a lot for some reason, which is really strange. I don't know. I'm kind of confused by how often that particular critique comes up when you also have people like, particularly like really big Red Rising readers who might try to read Ashes of Man recommended to them because it's like Red Rising, just to discover that Sun Eater is not nearly as action-packed as Red Rising is. So it's like, so why do the battle sequences overstay their welcome to so many other people? I don't know. It's just weird. I'm not going to bother to read the spoiler for this review here. Just because I want this video to be spoiler free and I don't want to have to skip anything in here, but I'm 99% certain I know exactly which spoiler that this is in reference to. Having just looked at the spoiler just now, it was exactly what I was in reference to, and I couldn't disagree more about this person's interpretation of what's going on there, but that's okay. I'll finish the series off when the time comes, but this book offered very little to the broader plot and did even less to excite me for the next. Well, lucky for you, actually, the last two books in Sun Eater are so intrinsically tied to what Ashes of Man brings to the table in terms of the broader series plot that you cannot have those two books exist the way that they do without Ashes of Man existing. Because when Kingdoms of Death was being written initially, it was Kingdoms of Death plus like the back half of Ashes of Man, basically. It was written or was starting to be written as one book before the publisher forced a split. And then Kingdoms of Death was Kingdoms of Death, and Christopher had to come up with basically an entire front half of Ashes of Man out of his pocket. And a lot of the things that were added and expanded upon out of that split, out of what happened there, made plot lines in Disquiet Gods and Shadows Upon Time, the last two books, just way, way, way bigger and way deeper than they ever would have been. You have new characters, you have characters taking bigger roles than they otherwise would have, and entirely new plot lines, basically, entirely new factions of people, groups that like otherwise were like kind of like very tangential at best that are now suddenly like actually pretty important. That's something that Ashes of Man did. So I hope this person continued with Disquiet Gods and hopes to continue with Shadows Upon Time as well, and that they work. I know that those two books are going to be a little bit more, I guess controversial might be the term, just in terms of a little bit of the content in them, but if you think that Ashes of Man offers little in the way of broader plot, you haven't read the next two books yet, so that's just very funny and very ironic that that's what came of that. Anyway, let's give another review a look here and say, sigh, mild spoilers ahead, but not enough to hit the button. So, I guess be warned about that. Anyway, yeah, I might fully be out after this one. This is absolutely sunk cost fallacy at this point. I mean, I might continue, but Lord knows after that one, I don't know how much more disappointed I can get. It feels like chasing the dragon off the second book. Chasing the dragon off the second book. Maybe the next one will make it worth it, I say to myself, but it never does. There wasn't much in this book which didn't grossly outstay its welcome, from each of the characters, except the Emperor, seeing more of his character was nice, to the constant, repetitive, overly expository nature of the prose, to the shock ending, quote-unquote, that I had been expecting since the middle of Book 3. All the elements meander, and even with all that said, I can still imagine that there is a gem of a series in these books. That gem, however, would need every single book to cut at least a third of its length on the time-wasting nonsense, and rewrite the vast majority of characters to be more than names on a page or plot devices alone. Book 2 is exempt, though. You can cut that one down by only about a quarter. Wow, okay. So basically that entire paragraph really comes down to one statement, and that is basically with regards to my recommendation of Sun Eater as a whole. If you read Empire of Silence and Howling Dark, those first two books of the series, and you're still not sure, or if you're notably unenthused about major aspects or a major portion of the book, like saying that a quarter of Howling Dark, for example, could be cut, this series isn't for you. So definitely what this guy is saying, sunk cost fallacy, sorry, that's definitely what's happening here. That's basically all I can comment on what everything was said there without just spending way too long addressing every single point. Let me put it this way. If there was a synopsis for the 6th and 7th books, I'd read those so that I know what happens and be done with the whole thing. Well, fun fact, the entire series was spoiled on page 1 of book 1, but okay. I know this series is not for me. Yeah, you probably should have quit 3 books ago with that other paragraph. But yeah, fair enough. I'm sure there will be someone at some point that will have synopses for books 6 and 7 out there, just so you can see what actually happens. But judging by the way this person feels about the series as a whole, I doubt that they would even have anything good to say about what happens in books 6 and 7, even from a synopsis standpoint. But anyway, and yet, curiosity might just get me to read the 6th because I am weak. A weak, synopsisless, and disappointed man that just wants to finish what he started. That 2 out of 5 reflects my feelings on the series as a whole at this point, but maybe as an individual novel, I would give it 2.5 because I'm nice. That's actually pretty generous considering what you just said about all of this, but fair enough. Anyway, one more review to go through for Ashes of Man, and that is very short. It is just Matt saying, I'll never understand why these books are so popular. Marlowe is such a douche. Big disagree. He's like 800 years old and still acts like the Marlowe from the first book. Incorrect. Like, no character growth at all. Again, incorrect. Objectively incorrect, but I'm not going to go into all of my grievances with the people who don't like Hadrian and can't distinguish between narrator Hadrian and on-page Hadrian, and especially the way that he has changed between different books, but that's just me. All of that was just an incorrect review. Anyway, finally, our last book here is going to be Les Mis by Victor Hugo. It is a long... Here we go. I'm sure that most of the critiques that I'm going to experience in these reviews are going to be completely valid, and I've had my fair share of arguing with friends about this book as well. So here goes. Rochelle says, I'm assuming that's how that's supposed to be pronounced, Rochelle, says, Les Mis was a tough one for me. I very nearly DNF'd this one. I was, however, reading the unabridged version of the book. I'd recommend anyone interested in Les Mis pick up an abridged copy for at least the first read-through. See, I'll address this later. Reading the unabridged version of Les Mis feels like Victor Hugo has dumped all of the research he did for the story's various events into the novel itself. This equates to the book being 30% story, 30% history lesson, 5% English lesson, 15% philosophy lesson, 15% author's opinion, and 5% superfluous descriptions. The events directly pertaining to the characters are interesting and enjoyable, which is why I awarded Les Mis 2 stars instead of 1, except the review has 1 up here. But to address all of that, no small amount of that is actually correct. I would not say that story is only 30% of the book. I would say probably solid 60% of Les Mis is actually story, plot stuff, and that plot stuff is good. But about reading an abridged version, it's hard to say because I've not encountered an abridged version of Les Mis that is abridged properly. I think that Les Mis would be the easiest book in the world to abridge because you could just cut out all of the tangents. Les Mis is famous for its tangents. It's famous for the sections of the book that are about the research, that are about, you know, the history lessons and stuff like that, that are superfluous. You know, that's a valid critique because there's no small chunk of this book that is that kind of material. But the problem is that I haven't encountered myself, and I'm totally open to being wrong. I'm sure there's a version that exists, but I haven't personally seen an abridgment of Les Mis that is any longer than maybe a couple hundred pages. And I'm sorry, but the 1,300 pages that Les Mis is, at least 700 pages of that could be kept. minimum 500, right? Without any tampering at all, like just cutting out tangents, right? You could cut out a solid few handfuls or handful 100 of pages, just cutting out all of the tangent stuff, but you don't need to touch anything else, quite frankly. If you just cut out those tangent sections, those little chapters, those books in there that are tangents, you would have a glorious book. So I understand the taking issue with the tangents for sure, but recommending to read an abridged version is a little bit hard for me because I would need like evidence and have to be able to confirm for myself that that abridged version is a proper abridgment that just cuts out all of the stuff that isn't plot but keeps literally all of the plot intact. If you could find that, I would recommend doing that too rather than the unabridged. But anyway, I started reading Les Mis shortly after the movie came out in 2013. I prefer to read the book before seeing the movie, and I attempted to do this with Les Mis, and boy did that backfire. Nearly a year after the movie's release, I still haven't seen it, and I initially stopped reading Les Mis about a quarter of the way through, about 300 to 400 pages, and all my excitement for the book was dried up. I had reached what my family now refers to as the Waterloo section. Well, it is literally the Waterloo section. For those not familiar with the book, the Waterloo section is a huge detour from the story, and I would guess it's 50 to 100 pages in length. I think it's 40 pages in length, based off of a 1,300-page edition of the book. And fair enough, I nearly got stalled on the Waterloo section. It took until I basically finished the book before I appreciated it properly. While I was reading Waterloo, I was miserable as well. But there are certain aspects of it that actually come back around a little bit later in the book that make it worth it. Even though I think that even the Waterloo section could have been a solid like half as long probably, and that would have been fine. But this was the first roadblock I had reached in my journey to finish. Yeah, I can understand that about Waterloo. It's definitely a pretty rough section. In the Waterloo section, the author communicates to the reader an enormous amount of information regarding the Battle of Waterloo, and the reader's reward for making it through this monstrosity is a minute glimpse at two of the secondary characters. This is pretty indicative to what the rest of the book is like, and hit 3 more roadblocks before the end. This is not a book you can just breeze through. Reading this book is a serious commitment of time and brain power. Definitely a commitment of time, that's for sure. As far as like those roadblocks, I can understand that. Like I said, there are various different like tangent sections where like you have entire sections of like 40, 50, 60 pages that are not plot relevant. They're kind of extra material that you don't strictly have to read actually. And that's why Les Mis would be the easiest book in the world to abridge. Let's see, I'll be perfectly honest with you all. The only reason I finished this book is my boyfriend bribed me with nerdy collectibles and a new PC game. I'm not proud of it, but I needed that motivation to finish the book. Never in my life have I experienced the range of emotions I felt during my read-through of Les Mis, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Yeah, basically all of that's valid, honestly, especially when you say, like, making such a big point about Waterloo. Yeah, Waterloo was maybe my least favorite part of the book until I finished. I think Waterloo was the section that I struggled the most with personally, so that's all fair. My only real issue with this review is recommending an abridged version, because you would have to have a very specific abridged version for this to work, in my opinion. Anyway, 2 more reviews to look through. One of these says, War and Peace seemed 1,000 pages too short. This book, unfortunately, seemed 1,000 pages too long. Oof. I love both these books, by the way. Victor, do we really need 4 full chapters about the sewers of Paris and the poetic side of excrement? No, we don't. That's why a proper abridged version of Les Mis would just cut out the tangents like that. And are we really supposed to believe that all of the thugs, thieves, murderers, and other scoundrels haunting Paris, the one guy, Inspector Javert, is really intent on capturing is the guy who stole a loaf of bread 20 to 30 years before? I guess that's a valid critique, but not really investigating that character work quite as deeply as maybe would be charitable. Yeah, I get it, the French legal system was unfair, but come on, this is ridiculous. Yeah, still fair enough. But yeah, as far as that comment feels 1,000 pages too long, perhaps just a little bit over the mark on that one, but I could still understand it. Like I said, you could cut out at least a few hundred pages of this and not actually lose any of the plot. Quite literally. Final review. Brenna Cummings says, Save yourself the misery and just read the abridged version. No, no, not this again, please. Did editors exist when Victor Hugo wrote this? This was a very different time in publishing, so, anyway, I wish that brevity had been more popular. The issue wasn't brevity, though. The issue is just tangents, because the actual plot material there is all very, very good. Very good. Anyway, the character's internal and spoken dialogue is so excessive. I would disagree with that point. This book is 35% plot and 55% long-winded history, laced with opinions or unnecessary lengthy descriptions, and 10% random opinionated tirade. Well, to be fair, no small amount of classic books could have a percentage ratio similar to this, actually. That'd be a valid critique for basically every classic ever. After a chapter-long tirade about how much the author hates slang and a whole section focusing on the entire history of the Paris sewer system, I really started to care less. I hate it when people use this wrong. Anyway, about the resolution of the actual storyline. See, it's just the tangents. It's not about the plot, it's about the tangents. Honestly, the characters weren't that intriguing. Disagree personally, but I've heard that from plenty of other people as well. The plot was so drawn out that very little of it felt meaningful. I don't think the plot itself actually feels drawn out. I think it's just all of the tangents that spread it apart so much that people kind of lose it. Yes, we get it. Jean Valjean suffered unnecessarily for a petty crime. Marius just kind of sucks, and he struggles to forgive anyone for presumed wrongs. Cosette and Marius's love story is merely young love at first sight. Boring. Javert's redemption arc is hardly an arc, since he is unchanging right up until the moment where he does something mildly decent, which he immediately regrets doing. Proud of myself for completing this, but wow, there are so many books better than this. Perhaps I would have enjoyed it more if I was a simp for French history. Ironically, I'm not even a simp for French history. In fact, I actually, well, the impression that Victor Hugo gives in this book is that he's actually very sympathetic towards, like, French revolutionaries, for example. I don't know whether that's the case for sure, but if it is, I don't sympathize with French revolutionaries at all. I think that the French revolutions are arguably amongst the worst revolutions to ever happen, because there was about 50,000 of them, and not a single one of them did a damn bit of good for anybody. But I'm not a simp for French history at all. I just happen to really love this book, so that's kind of a funny point. But that is going to be the end of this video. That is all the reviews that I have to cover. I hope you enjoyed my reactions to some of these 1-star reviews. If you would like to see more of these, like I said at the beginning of this, feel free to let me know in the comments below, and I'll do a couple more of these videos for some of my other favorite books of all time, maybe even including some more recent favorites that weren't even included in my original favorite books of all time video back in the end of May 2025. So if that's something you're interested in, like I said, let me know. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, whatever that may be.